Hi all, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyday life as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Every week there's something different, so click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. This week's guest is Dr. Lorraine Wilson. She's an award-winning writer, biologist, herder of cats, and drinker of tea. Having spent years working in remote corners of the world, she now lives by the sea in Scotland and writes stories full of wilderness and folklore, exploring themes of family, belonging, and the legacy of trauma. Her debut novel won the SCKA for Best Debut and was a finalist for the Kavya Prize and the British Fantasy Awards for Best Fantasy Novel and Best Newcomer. Most recently, she had her novella The Last to Drown published by Luna Press that came out in February 2024, and we'll be focusing on that. It's a fantastic book. I really recommend it. So thank you so much for coming, Lorraine.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Really looking forward to chatting.
Yes, I have so many questions, both about your writing and your experiences as a marine biologist. So,
Well, yeah, more generally, I did some marine stuff and a lot of terrestrial stuff as well. So I didn't specialize very well, which is probably a bit of a career flaw. But,
I see.
yeah.
I saw you described as marine biologist somewhere. So I was,
Oh,
and I thought since since The Last to Drown is just so intimately connected to the sea, I thought that is just very beautiful. Like, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to writing?
um, yeah. So I worked in conservation ecology, and I was doing that up to about 10 years ago. And then I think my cats are going to join the Zoom, so I apologize for
Amazing.
cat interruptions.
Never
um,
apologize for a cat.
and then about 10 years ago, I got sick. I developed long-term illnesses that meant I couldn't carry on with the research fellowship that I was doing. And that was when I turned to writing. And I didn't know if I would be able to do it, didn't know if I would be any good at it, but I wanted something that would give me an outlet and a challenge and a sort of a focus to structure my day around now that I'd lost this big part of myself. And I very luckily kind of landed on my feet, and I love it. And I've found an amazing community within the writing world. And I've had I've managed to get published and find some wonderful readers. So
And
uh,
how as well.
so it was a strange career switch, sort of forced by other circumstances, but I feel very lucky to have arrived where I am now.
Yes, and I mean your love of nature and your love of the sea is just so apparent in your writing as well. So it doesn't feel like a switch so much. It just feels like a slight tweak in the direction of the efforts.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely still my love of the wilderness is definitely embedded in everything I write, I think, and I think it probably always will be, because that's just how I see the world, you know?
Mm.
So I couldn't write without that, because that's my lens kind of thing. Um, yeah, and I was thinking while I was writing something a while ago and thinking about the commonalities between science and writing in the way that I do. And I think there's a lot of similarity in the fact that science and storytelling both start with the question of why or how
Mm.
is this thing. And most storytelling started with folklore, didn't it? And folklore started with the attempts to answer. A lot of folklore is about answering that question, why does this happen, or how does that happen? And science is exactly the same, and they obviously go off on very divergent paths after that, but they carry that same seed of kind of curiosity and wonder, um, and a seeking of answers and of narratives. And I think that there is a surprising shared route to both creative writing and science, I reckon.
Absolutely. I'm not sure it's even that surprising. It's just, it's so, like I said in the introduction to the podcast, like for me, storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, like whether they
Yeah.
realize it or not. And
Mhm.
you know, when you say you worked in sort of conservation, like, you know, environmental conservation, and done research in that direction, you know, messaging and
Mhm.
describing what you do is just such an important part of it, because it's not enough to be a researcher and love the science and, you know, notice interesting things about this particular larva of this particular moth. Like, you know, if you want to help people understand why they need to protect it, you know, you
Mm.
need to utilize storytelling. Otherwise, you're not going to be a very good conservationist, because you're not going to be able to actually communicate with people that can make things happen.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the ability to create appealing narratives or accessible narratives and turn the science into something that can capture the attention of non-scientists and capture the emotion of non-scientists is a really important skill. And I think it's a tension that exists within conservation science, because scientists aren't supposed to be emotional. They're supposed to be very factual in how they um, dispense information, and yet with conservation and with climate change science, it is such an emotional subject, because
Mm.
you know, we care about it deeply, and we're deeply worried, and we're, you know, deeply passionate about these things. So it's a weird tension, I think, for scientists to create narratives that are emotionally engaging, but that don't get the scientists labeled as being overly emotional. It's a
Yes.
weird, it's an odd territory, I think, for scientists to exist in at the moment. And I don't envy the people who are at the forefront of science communication, that's for sure.
Yes, for sure, because there are always other interests that push at
Mhm.
what you're trying to communicate. I did an interview recently with Chantal Lyons, who is a British conservationist who sort of wrote recently a book about wild boar in England.
Uh-huh.
And a huge part of what she does is try to also dispel the misunderstanding of the species of
Yeah.
wild boar, and to kind of overcome English, typically English reluctance to interact with, you know, wildlife in a way that
Yeah.
is not super convenient for us.
Yeah. England has become very used to being very, very buffered from the natural world and from the sort of anything that might be potentially dangerous, more dangerous to us than a roe deer or something.
Yeah.
So it's a definite issue with things like talking about wild boar introduction and lynx introduction and stuff, is those misunderstandings and those false narratives that have been created. Yeah.
Absolutely. So
That must have been something that you noticed coming from Poland, because the relationship with the natural world, with the ecosystem being that much more complex and complete in parts of Poland, you must notice the difference in relationship.
there is a lot of pressure, and recently there's been a change in government in Poland, but
Yeah.
not to get too bogged down in in Polish politics, which are maybe not of interest to as many people as I would want. But but the previous government was very anti-environment, and it was
Uh-huh.
anti-conservation, and they have done tremendous damage to the
Yeah.
Polish ecosystem. They have done tremendous damage to Polish forests. They have,
Yeah. Bielowieża.
yeah, not just Białowieża. You know, this is something but like process of making forests into basically profitable farms
Mm.
for timber. It's just, you know, looking at it's a way of looking at the environment in this way, that it's there to serve us.
Yeah.
And it's that particular kind of sort of nationalism, and a very particular kind of you know, religious zeal that sort of
Mm.
sees the world and sees the environment as there to serve our immediate needs, rather than something that we are kind of supposed to be looking after,
Yeah.
which is yeah,
It's
difficult.
not ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, going to your novella, sort of moving on to the novella, The Last to Drown. It's such a beautiful story of memory, grief, and connection. And I was sort of drawn to your description. So it's basically, the story, it stays very close to the sea. And you describe the sea as restless, universal, and lost. It was constantly dying and being reborn. I really like that line. And I was wondering what sort of drew you to that concept of the sea and how you linked it to the story of a protagonist.
I don't know. I live next to the sea, so it is a constant presence in my life, and I think that definitely affects how I view it. And I view it as a force and a presence. And I did a lot of research on marine and coastal mythologies when I was actually researching my previous book, Mother Sea. And I was really drawn to the universality of coastal mythologies and maritime mythologies. And I know you interviewed Eliza Chan recently about Fathom
Yes.
Folk, and she was talking about that as well, which was really interesting, because our books couldn't be more different, but it's just fascinating. And I think it speaks to the kind of lure that the sea has for us. There's something very almost hypnotic about its constancy and its power and its moods, and the way that it can be such a different thing on different days. Just with a change of the light, it becomes completely, it can shift from being menacing to enticing, with a shift of cloud. And I think that well, as a writer, that's such a powerful thing to play with, because it's so mercurial and it gives you such a rich toolkit to draw from and to create atmosphere and to use as for subtext within your scenes. But also, I just think it's such an we as humans have such an interesting relationship with the sea, and that's mirrored in our folklore. The way that the sea is both a resource and the thing that coastal communities depend on for life, but it's also often the greatest risk and one of the most proximate causes of death in coastal communities. So it's and when we were sailing, sort of with before the Industrial Revolution and stuff, when sailing was a much more hazardous thing than it is now, it was the same thing. We were dependent on trade, particularly island countries like Britain, and yet it was also an incredibly hazardous thing, and people were just lives were destroyed, and wealth and businesses were destroyed through it as well. So it's just, I love that dichotomy, and I'm always drawn to things that are like that have the kind of two-faced God sort of thing to it. I just think there's an innate tension in that is wonderful to draw from as a writer. And you can use that in so many different ways. I think I never really get tired of seeking out those points of dichotomy and points of mirroring within folklore and within the environment, world around us.
Yes.
It's just fun imagery and fun stuff to play with.
Yes, and I love how, sort of drawing on that, when people talk about loving the sea, when sailors talk about loving the sea, they it's almost couched in romantic terms, in this sort of passionate love, because the danger is always there and acknowledged. So it's you can describe it in this sort of like this, the sea is like a lover, and
Yeah.
but there is danger in love too, and it's just that, and like you say, that dichotomy is what draws people, and it's interesting that we can be drawn to something that can kill us, which is obviously
Yeah.
a lot in the story, that is such a huge theme. And something you sort of touched on, I don't want to sort of draw too much out of you on that subject, obviously, but the main character Tinny is sort of, her old life has ended in a way with a terrible accident where her husband dies, and she is both disfigured and injured in a way that leaves her with permanent nerve damage. So she has trouble walking. Her one of her arms is not working as it used to. She can't feel things because of a nerve damage, and she has trouble adjusting and accepting, I think, in a way that would allow her to move forward. And fragility, I feel, is such a theme in this novella. Not just the protagonist's fragility, but there is the way she notices the world. Like there's a bit where you talk about the scarred face and scarred lichen covered stones of Lilith's house. Which did you mean it as a kind of this, like, what drew you to write this? Obviously your own experience of starting a new life, and a kind of in this sort of symbolic way. Did you sort of mean it to be like more autobiographical, or did you want it to be?
Yeah, I mean, I very deliberately chose to write from that point of view of chronic pain for the first time. That's something I live with, and I've never written it before because it's not fun to live. So why would I want to spend time in it on the page when I can escape it on the page? But I decided I wanted to explore it in fiction and just see what I could do with that voice and putting that voice out there, and where I could take it. So it was a conscious decision to explore that kind of voice through Tina in the book. And I think it's interesting you talking about the sort of the death of her old life and coming to terms with her new life, because I hadn't consciously thought of that. But I think when people who are born able-bodied and become disabled or chronically ill, there is that process of grief. When you lose, you have to reconcile yourself to what you've lost and the parts of yourself that you've lost, and learn to live within this sort of shrunken almost version of yourself and the life that you can have. And that is a profound grieving process, and it carries with it all those stages of grief, the anger and the sort of denial and all that sort of stuff. So I hadn't really thought of that bit as mirroring me, as being autobiographical, but I can see how it might well be, perhaps unconsciously, because that is definitely something I had to go through myself, and I have talked about, before. And I think, I don't know, I didn't write this as a kind of sort of self-therapy thing, because I've done my grieving for what I am now, where I am now. But I wanted to partly I wanted to put it out there so that other people like me have a voice, that a story that they can read and see themselves reflected in, because that's sort of classic thing. It's just nice to have more voices out there in bookshops. But also partly there's something very liminal and weird about being in a state of chronic pain, and quite possibly being heavily medicated as well, where the lines of reality and unreality kind of blur. And that was actually a really interesting state to explore, and I've never managed to express what that feels like before, when I'm trying to tell people what it's like to live with, to be in that sort of fugue state of high pain and high medication. So it was really fun and kind of cathartic almost to be able to write that and really lean into it and really go, okay, I'm not just a bit drugged and wandering around in a daze. I'm going to start seeing things that aren't there, and I'm going to start hearing people that aren't there, and I'm just going to really lean into this whole thing and make it as dark and weird and twisted as I can. And that was it was incredibly fun to play with that, and this sort of the liminality of that state of mind. And it was it's weird whenever you go into something, as a writer, whenever you go into something that's quite voicey in that way, you run the risk of making it harder for people to access as readers. So you have to kind of find a line, don't you, that's accessible and engaging, but also representative of that perhaps unfamiliar mind state.
It felt very honest, and it felt like it was really, like you really utilized this to sort of create this sense of tension in the book, when there's obviously the threat. I don't want to do spoilers, but and there is something such a disquieting sort of element of not knowing what is real and what isn't in the moment, and not being 100% certain that, you know, the person that's calling you is actually the person who you think it is, or, you know, or whether you're going in the right direction, that kind of thing. And I think you've done it quite beautifully. And I was thinking also in terms of sort of the fragility and sort of the courage that the main character has. I was sort of looking at the bits that when you described the damage that was done to her in the accident, in the nerve damage. The thing that really interested me, it was you sort of repeated quite a few times about how the nerve damage in her hand meant that she could injure herself without feeling the hurt. So because she couldn't feel things properly with her hand, but she could still touch things. So if she touched something that was really hot, she could get burnt without realizing. She could get hypothermia without realizing. And that is a theme that I saw repeated in the novella in sort of wider sense about. So it kind of got me thinking about how individually, or, you know, in a group, we do things that don't hurt in a moment, but that they can leave long-term damage. And obviously the environmental factor is the obvious one in you know, like, I don't know, the fashion for microplastics in cosmetics, like the little beads that will like take you know, and then you know, the marine biologists must have just been screaming into the void. And but it's also in terms of the society. So there's like a theme of something happening in the past, but someone does something in the past, and like the later generations just have to sort of suffer through consequences. Was that a conscious thing you did?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've always been interested in the intergenerational nature of trauma, and how it isn't you know, something that happens in a fixed point and is expressed through the life of that person. It has a ripple effect, and it passes on to children and grandchildren, and, you know, that's both genetic and behavioral, which is weird and fascinating. But that does interest me, and I am intrigued by that idea. And I think you're right, the idea as well of sometimes another aspect of psychology that interests me is the way that our learned responses, our adaptive responses that we often pick up in childhood or as a result of trauma, feel like they are healthy responses in later moments of stress. We react in a way that we learned to react in the past, and it feels like the healthy way to react because it's how we trained ourselves to deal with something, but it's not healthy. It's, you know, it's a trauma response rather than a healthy sort of emotionally resilient response, and that's often not apparent. And I think that that's something. Oh God, I've got my alarm going off. Sorry. That's something that interests me as well, in the way that we can be trapped by our own scars, if you know what I mean. We, you know, we develop these unconscious behavior patterns that are not helpful, but they feel helpful. They feel safe and secure because they're familiar. But you have to kind of retrain yourself to forge new pathways. And I think with this, I was kind of trying to look at that as well, and how like the aunt and the family have clung to a certain behavior response that keeps them safe in the fear and the superstition that they are living under. And it's it's only by breaking away from that and trying to do something else that pattern can be changed, and the perhaps real healing can happen rather than coping. And I think, yeah, that was something I was interested in exploring, and it is, like you say, it is a wider question that we face as a society as well. But it's definitely at the individual level in this story rather than the bigger picture. Because it's a novella, so there's only so much you can do with a novella.
Yes, I mean, you have managed to squeeze a lot in there. There is it's the responses and the sort of that are rooted in, you know, like, well, that are maybe not healthy, and it's so interesting to say that, like, because we can only really realize that they're unhealthy in retrospect often. It's
Yeah,
very difficult to sort of see it in the moment, and sometimes even in retrospect you feel like maybe the old behavior would have been more beneficial, but it's not the healthiest way to react.
yeah,
I was talking about it with my friends actually the other day, about how I used to be a lot more reactive, and I used to be very much if someone sort of wronged me, I would react in a moment, and I would react very forcefully. If someone accosted me, if someone was sort of verbally abusive to me, I would react very, very forcefully. And I have, through sort of introspection, managed to sort of tone it down so that I do not have that knee-jerk aggressive reaction if someone is aggressive towards me. But sometimes it feels, you know, when I do meet with a, you know, with a sort of unpleasant situation, and I kind of feel like in the past I would have really put that person in their place, but it's like I would have to undo all the self-work and all my personal growth in order to behave in this way.
yeah. And sometimes they need putting in their place, but you have to do it from a position of deliberate choice, I guess, to act in that way rather than the knee-jerk thing.
Yes,
But
but I think when you sort of work on it, like, it's not as easy to react very quickly because you're
no,
questioning whether the reaction
yeah,
is the right one. And obviously there's two sisters in the novella who have made a choice. Perhaps it was a choice that they kind of, you know, it was a choice of their ancestors that was just passed on to react to negative things with silence and just not pass on information, which is very unhealthy. And it just made me think, in storytelling sense, it's like, what are the dangers of not telling the old stories?
yeah. And I think that's true. I think there's a lot of value in storytelling and in holding on to old stories. And I think that's something that, I mean, folklore is ever popular in fiction, isn't it? And fiction is full of retellings, particularly at the moment. You know, there's a big popularity in retellings, and I think they will always be popular to a degree. But it's only a fairly narrow band of folklore that gets the retellings. And as with languages worldwide being endangered and minority languages being threatened, I think that the folklore is threatened as well. And when you lose the folklore, you lose such a rich understanding of both the society that birthed that folklore, but also the environment that society was birthed in, and the relationship that the people had with their environment. And I think that's an amazing resource, and it's a really important one. And it's so important to have those stories and to keep them alive. And whether that's through retellings or through just archiving, I don't know. That's, you know, I'm not a specialist in that sort of stuff, but I love the fact that old stories are kept alive through retellings. I think that's an incredibly organic, natural process for some things that have an oral storytelling history. But I wish there was more breadth in what is appealing to traditional publishing.
Yes, I definitely feel like, you know, like since I kind of talk about, you know, in my books, I use Slavic folklore
Yeah.
and Slavic mythology. The interest is quite narrow, I feel, and there's definitely like responses to some of my books and like, yeah, this is great, but we already have one of those. We already have something that touches on Slavic stuff. So so I think it's breadth and depth of interest.
Yeah.
You know, like as much as I love Greek mythology, you know, we can have sometimes 5 to 10 books inspired by Greek mythology in 1 month.
And not many of them written by Greeks or Greek
Oh,
diasporic
none.
authors.
Actually, I had a conversation with an Italian writer the other day, and he was saying that there was this list of like, I think I don't remember. I think he said something like top 15 or something, top 20 books inspired by Greek and Roman mythology, and he was like, no, there was not one, not even one person with any links to Greek and like, you know, Italian heritage. And it's like, you know, I very much believe and I very much feel that everyone should be able to write anything they want, as long as as long as they can research it, as long as they understand what they can research it. However, it does, that being said, it feels really strange that people from those cultures are excluded.
I think Britain, England in particular, has a very strangely possessive attitude towards Greek and Roman literature and Greek and Roman classic history, and it's all entwined with British exceptionalism and the classic educations at Eton and Oxbridge, and just empire and all that sort of rottenness. But it is very odd, and I think it has led to this belief that Britain owns the Greek and Roman mythology in a way, because all these rich boys were taught it when they were 7 at boarding school, so therefore they own it.
Well, there's something to be said for the conquered people to, like, you know, have a right to access the conqueror, but in that sense, it feels very possessive, I could say.
It does, and I think, like you say, I think if people are with care and attention, people can write outside their own identities and outside their own cultures, but there needs to be balance. And if it's only white middle class women writing Greek mythology, that's not. And when there are Greek authors trying to get published and writing beautifully, but being told, well, we've already got Greek mythology on our list, that's not ideal. You know, that balance needs to swing the other way a little bit.
Like, why can't we have both, right? Like, why do we have to choose one? Sometimes, although that is not the case with Greek mythology, where we have a glut of it. The Icelandic sort of folktale traditions, they're really, like, you touch, obviously you don't have a lot of space in the novella to, you know, go into great depth, but do you why Icelandic folklore? What draws you to it?
I had always been, I read a lot of folklore, and I grew up as a kid reading folklore from anywhere and everywhere I could get hold of. And so I had always loved the Norse and Icelandic and Celtic mythologies and how they all intertwine. And then when I went to Iceland, I just fell in love with it as well. And just, it's such an amazing country, and it's so emotionally powerful in a weird way, like nowhere else on earth. It's so unique and so just very oddly resonant. And I think it's a little bit like Ireland and places in Scotland, the mythology still feels very real and still feels very present. And you still have the little elf houses in the garden and stuff. And, even if people don't believe it, they still do it because, you never know. So you got to sort of play it safe kind of thing. And I love that. I love the presence of it. And so after I'd been to Iceland, I did a lot more reading. I fell down a bit of a research wormhole, and I couldn't hope to cover lots of Icelandic mythology within this story, but it was just this one story of the follower that tied in with my, like I've already said, my fascination with the idea of the legacy of trauma down through families, and the idea of this follower ghost who is like an inherited guilt. It is, it's that sort of symbolic familial shame, and some wrong that the family has done becomes inherited by each subsequent generation in that family. And that just fascinated me, that there was a ghost that symbolized this sort of psychological thing that I'm interested in. So I couldn't resist, really. And I was very, very drawn to that. And when this character and the story started to come to mind, that was a very natural partnership for me, the setting and that ghost and this story.
Yes, it definitely felt that. And like you said, like Icelandic folklore it still feels real. It still feels like people are linked to it. And it's sort of coming back to, like, the danger of not looking to old wisdoms, to ignoring all, cutting yourself willingly from your own context. I think is something that happens a lot, and then it's very difficult to get that context back, like you have with your protagonist. I was wondering, because you describe yourself as a sort of third culture Scot. Is that sort of drawn from your experience of connecting to a new place and losing a connection with the old?
I think so. I mean, I'm the child of immigrants. I'm mixed race, and I've never belonged particularly. I've never fitted neatly in any particular box. And I think that question of trying to navigate your own unique landscape of belonging is something that is in all of my stories, because it's just such a central part of my own experience of the world. And that's definitely within The Last to Drown, within this particular book, that is expressed in Tina trying to find her way through to this new life and trying to reconcile herself to it, and also the family secret sort of coming to the surface and having to reshape the nature of the relationships within the family. So yeah, it's definitely something that has had such a profound effect on my sense of self and my sense of how I fit within whichever society I happen to be in different parts of the world. That it's something that is in all of my stories, and it's something, weirdly, that writing fiction has helped me to understand better. It wasn't something I really had managed to map out very successfully for myself before I started writing fiction. And it was only when I was writing fiction and being able to explore these ideas of identity and belonging through different characters and different worlds on the page that I began to understand how I can be neither one thing nor the other, and yet still that's okay. And I can accept all of the different facets of myself and claim belonging whilst remaining aware of my relative privilege, because I'm light-skinned, because I sound very British, because I have a British name, etc., etc. And that's been a really empowering process, and I'm really grateful to the storytelling for giving me that sort of sense of courage in exploring these issues in a way that perhaps I hadn't been brave enough to do before. So yeah, it's an interesting process, what you discover about yourself when you start writing fiction, I
Yeah.
think.
I think it gives you a safe space also to sort of
Yeah.
discover certain things. That was a theme I definitely sort of empathized with, because obviously I'm an immigrant, and I have now lived in the UK for more than half my life. And
Yeah.
so I am culturally more like, when I go to Poland, I feel very British. And
Yeah.
and here I am still like a bit apart culturally, and it's kind of learning to sort of straddle two cultures. And obviously people will always see you as just like one thing,
Yeah.
because they want to put you in a box, and that's fine. You know, this is not you know, my sense of my own identity, or how I see myself. Like I don't feel like I have a right to impose it on like English people to see me suddenly as being very British or whatever, because I know I'm not. But it
Mm.
does sort of raise questions for yourself about what you're losing. Like, you know, like when you live somewhere long enough, you lose language. And obviously Tinny
Yeah.
is no longer fluent in Icelandic, which she seems to struggle with quite a bit, because there's a lot about um, there's a big theme of memory and sort of feeling disconnected from your past self. You know, she's for her it's like dual issue, because she's disconnected from her more recent memories because of the accident. So she has trouble remembering her beloved husband. She has trouble remembering her life before the accident. And at the same time, she has uh, because of having been kind of ripped out of her native language, her sort of, you know, native country, and been told that she can't even ask questions about it, she feels disconnected from her culture.
Mm.
Is that kind of like how important was memory in the sense of sort of connecting to you in writing this?
Uh, I think that's I mean the memory, the idea of her having amnesia was really just started from wanting to push her as a character to a point where she would be prepared to make bargains that she should perhaps not be making. So to give her something that she felt like she could get back, whereas she couldn't get back her husband. He's, you know, he's gone, and there's no, she's not um, lost enough within herself to believe in sort of resurrection, but she could hope for those memories back, and that gives her that hope is dangerous because it makes her desperate enough to make all sorts of strange bargains. So the memory thing, in the immediate memory loss, was really a plot point for me. It was something that a mechanism that I wanted to employ. But the wider question of dislocation from her home, from her childhood home, and coming back and not fitting is, yeah, that's something that I am really drawn to, and it's one of the sort of defining features of my family is the gaps. You know, when you have a family that's going sort of 3 generations back, I have to go before I find somebody who didn't migrate somewhere. So there are so many gaps. There's so much about my family history I just don't know, because if you records and people become so easily lost once you migrate. And once those, you know, sort of that becomes generational migration, it's things vanish very quickly, and you become severed from things very quickly. And that those sort of gaps in my heritage have been as important as the things that are present. They weigh as much as the memories that are there, because they shape you just as strongly. So I think that is a theme that interests me, and how we're shaped as much by the things we lose as by the things we hold on to. And that was, I think, what I was trying to explore a little bit in her homecoming, and it not being entirely a homecoming.
Yes, it definitely felt like there was this sort of sense of lack of connection, and like which was exacerbated by the sort of persistent silence of the main character's mother and aunt, who just like, especially mother, it was quite extraordinary sort of bit where the main character and her brother sort of text each other and like just reminisce about when their mother was asked about why they left when they were small children, or they were like 6 and 9 or something. And the mother, just without saying a word, she just left and didn't come back until the next day, leaving her 2 small children alone. And that felt so that felt an extreme version of something that feels very familiar.
Okay.
And I feel like it's familiar in a sense that, like, you know, growing up in Poland, everybody carries generational trauma. And I did not even know that this term existed until a few years ago. I had never heard of it. Because when you grow up in a place where, you know, your textbooks, like literature textbooks from the, you know, age of about 8 plus, include stories of the Holocaust, it's so normalized, and there's like a lot of something that is a very familiar theme in a lot of Polish households, especially when it comes to the older generation women, so the grandmothers, the great grandmothers, is the lack of communication. So the women in Polish households, especially women from more agricultural areas, women from villages, they would communicate their love for food. That is a big one. So, but they would not show affection. They, you know, in other ways, they would take care of you in very practical ways, and that was them showing love. But communicating trauma is something that, like, silence is the starting point always.
That's such a that's such a deep trauma response, like you say. It's such a an understandable reaction to what those generations lived through, isn't it? But also it has an impact. It, you know, it shapes all of the subsequent generations still, the weight of that silence. It's
I mean, you know, there's stories even in my family that were just, you know, you find out about something quite horrific as an aside. It's like, oh, you know, like when your grandfather was 3 or 4 years old and he was forced to steal moldy bread from Nazi horses, and this happened. Like, so that's not even the main story.
Wow.
So it's and it's so common. And it's interesting when we talk about it now, because I think there is a growing appetite for, like you say, like just uncovering the things that were lost across several generations of people not passing things on. And I was interviewing Zuza Zak recently, who is the author of Slavic Kitchen Alchemy, which is it's many different things. It's like it's a scrapbook of recipes for medicines, for you know, natural cleaning products, for ways to treat certain illness, or like, you know, how to, like, nutrition, and mixed in stories from Polish folklore, or stories of her childhood and her grandmother's. And there's definitely an appetite for sort of uncovering those things, but once those things are lost, it's very difficult to create an accurate picture sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And it it's hard, isn't it? Because you want to get those stories down and you want to get them before that those generations are lost and before it's gone. But that means sort of, how do you do that? Do you force people to tell you, to share those stories with you? I don't know. It's such a tricky thing, and yet it would be such a loss if it's if those
Mm,
histories are entirely gone, without trace. But yeah, I don't know. It's a minefield, I think, emotionally.
for sure. Although I have to say that your novella makes a very compelling case for sharing the stories to avoid any pitfalls of losing the context of what's happening around you. So your novella definitely makes it clear what your stance on sharing generational stories
Please
is.
share the story. Do not be driven to, yeah, make sacrifices.
And on that very positive note, thank you so much for coming. And everyone, The Last to Drown came out in February. Snag now. It's a novella. It's a very easy read, but it's a very beautiful read too. So
Thank you very much.
thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you and see you next week.